Welcome to Google. Welcome to the Airflow Meetup. This is the first time Google is hosting a meetup. It definitely shows our commitment to, contribution to open source, contribution to Airflow. We're looking forward to host more Airflow events in the future. Before we dive into the talks, probably just quickly, give people an overview of tonight's agenda. So we'll start by, we have about 8 talks, 5 regular talks, and then 3 lightning talks. It's a good mix of, overview of Airflow, future directions, productionization, testing, deployment, tools, utilities. So it's a really good set of topics. At the very end of the talk, we are also going to invite all the committers come forward to the stage, and then have everyone in the room get a chance to ask any questions on Airflow to the committers. So with that, I'm probably going to start the first talk, which is myself. So it's really talking about like, thank you. So the first one we're talking about like running Airflow as a managed service called Composer. As some of you in the room may already know that Google has released a managed version of Apache Airflow earlier this year. We started with, we released our beta in May, and now we release our GA service during Google Next. So a lot of the content that I'm going to discuss today is really a teamwork. We have some Composer team members here. I know Maria is there, Trishka, Anna Houghton's here. So many of the lessons we learned are also sort of like contribution, feedback from our customers. Here's a quick agenda for my talk. We start by looking at some stats, where people store data. Really, all this really clearly points out that, there's a need for hybrid orchestration. And then with that, we give a little bit background on how Google approaches workflow orchestration and how we decide to settle on Apache Airflow. Then we continue to like gaps in Apache Airflow. Like it is great. I mean, if you run Apache Airflow for experimenting and launching like a small set of DAGs, it's great. But then there are a lot more you need to do to make it a managed service, to make it like really at a production scale and quality. Continue. We'll basically try to give a quick summary on feedback, issues we have heard from our customers that are using, Composer, but also like Apache Airflow. And finally, we wrap up the talk with next steps. So today, like data is, I don't have to emphasize the sheer scale of data, but then there's a few interesting stats I want to share with everyone. About 81% of organizations today already invest in multiple cloud service providers. And while you may think that people just, migrate and move all their workloads to cloud, but actually that's not true. But 95% of those companies also plan to continue invest in their private clouds. And a lot more companies, about 97% of companies, they all do plan to migrate to, even though they are not on cloud yet, but they also plan to migrate on-prem to cloud. So a few things that stand out here. Number one, people are going to have their workloads, have the data distributed in multiple cloud providers. Number two, people are still going to keep their on-prem setup, for various reasons. It's really clear that to us that, a hybrid cloud environment is likely the end state for most companies over the long term. So that really calls out for, some orchestration solution that works across multiple cloud providers as well on-prem. We actually started by looking at what people do today. I probably can skip these slides because people in this room mostly, you probably are very familiar with why cron script wouldn't work. That's why you move to Airflow. But for us, really, before we settle on any technology, any tool, we come up with this vision that for our customers, that it should be really easy for people to create, schedule, and monitor workflows that work both within and outside of Google Cloud Platform. So with that, we try to look around, try to evaluate alternatives. Obviously, people ask me during the mix and mingle session, like why Google did, what's Google's solution for workflows orchestration? Obviously, as you can probably guess out, we have a few in-house solutions for workflow, but then we decided that, to really make things work across cloud providers, to make things work for on-prem, we really want to start to build a product with open source in mind. That's why we look at Apache Airflow, which is extremely popular. I don't have to emphasize anything. In the fact that people will come to this session means it's a popular framework. So there are a lot of nice things about Apache Airflow. That's why I mentioned that if you want to run something quick, it's probably it won't take you a lot of time to set up an Airflow instance. It has a few very nice properties. Use Python, fairly easy to use language. There's also well-established interface. You have the CLI, web interface, and command line, which is really cool. Lots of dependency management. You can really construct very fancy DAGs if you want to go that far. And then the nice thing is that you also have lots of connectors, operators, hooks to other services. However, when we look at that, the Airflow is being an open source product, it tries to make a lot of the framework open and extendable. But when it comes to, as someone, if you want to run that as a service, for us as a managed service, we do realize that there are a lot of missing pieces. Or rather, a more accurate way of describing that is, they have a lot of pieces that wait for you to define and add into your product. It has a lot of similarity for people who are going to run Airflow within your work. If you have multiple teams or companies are going to use the same Airflow setup, you're probably going to run into a similar setup problem as us. One thing is that if you want to set up, at a scale, it takes a non-trivial amount of time for you to configure and set up your Airflow environment. And likewise, there's a lot of logging, monitoring. You still need to figure out those workflow signals yourself. Airflow has a nice way of the UI has nice logs, but monitoring metrics like workflow execution, you still need to pull out those metrics. The data exists there. If you look at the metadata database, you have all the workflow metrics, but you really need something to pull those metrics out for you so that you can readily consume by your SRE team, so that they can have this nice dashboard and alerting and monitoring configured for you. And last thing is really about the infrastructure reliability. So understanding those sort of things that we need to add into Apache Airflow to make it a managed service. So we look into things Google Cloud Platform can provide. I'm probably going to just quickly go over a few of those, highlighting infrastructure scalability. A lot of our products has built-in auto-scaling enabled. So that makes things really easy for you to manage infrastructure, but don't have to worry too much about how should I tune my cluster setup, tune the configs. Everything has been auto-configured for you. Security, we also realize that if you want to run the service in a shared environment, you probably want to have end-to-end security. Coming next, there's how would you sync your DAG? How would you provision a shared file system to your distributed Airflow instances? The last thing I just want to say is that really monitoring, debugging, and logging are so important. When it's probably okay if your workflow runs well, but whenever there's an issue when it comes to debugging, you really wish that those metrics are ready for you. So that's why we start to understanding the sort of some of the feature gap or production gap in Airflow. We sort of try to bring in things Google Cloud Platform is good at. And then our overall vision is that for Cloud Composer, we want it to be a managed service and want it to be achieve the things we mentioned earlier, make it easy for you to create a schedule and monitor workflows. As a user, you don't really have to worry about how should I set up my Airflow environment, how should I configure, how should I manage dependencies, how should I manage configuration updates. Some of the elements we feel like are essential for a managed service like a Cloud Composer, or in fact, even if you run a large-scale Airflow setup on-prem, those are probably the few things you want to pay attention to. You want to easy to manage, operate, and debug, reliability, service connectors. Airflow is as useful as the set of connectors or operators it has. Likewise, you want to make your system open. Even we try to run as a managed service, you want there exists an escape path for your customers whenever they find things can't satisfy by your managed or offered features. At least you should provide a mechanism for them to run things that you don't quite support at the moment. Last thing is probably like the things, even Airflow or Cloud Composer, both are trying to work to get to a perfect state where we have end-to-end DAG isolation and protection. I'll probably come to more to this point at the end. So some of the key features, we have tooling, Cloud SDK, Airflow Web UI. I'm probably going to show a lot of this as a very, very quick demo, like 1 or 2 minutes demo on Cloud Composer. So, if you look at things, one thing we truly want to do well is make a creating of a Composer environment super easy for you. If you go back, it's pretty much like a single-click deployment. Put any name you want to have for your Cloud Composer environment, and then say quick demo, and then select any properties you want. There are a lot of additional parameters you could configure, and then that's really what you need, like a single-click deployment. While waiting for the environment to be created, those are the additional things I want to mention as managed features. You want to make sure you have a consistent way that you can set Airflow configurations. Right? We know Airflow has a lot of configuration on setting timeout, setting various scheduler behaviors. So those, you want a way to, especially when you run your setup in a distributed fashion, you want a good way so that your configs are easily propagated to all your instances. Likewise, for environment variables, dependency management. The other thing is that Web UI, about 70 to 80% of our customers, or in fact, it's probably also true in general, people interact with Airflow using the Web UIs. So you want a UI to be publicly available and also securely protected. That's why one thing we put into Composer is really like, integrate with one of our security solution so that you need to log in, and also the way to manage login is the same as the way how you manage your regular access to GCP resources. Coming back to this, I'm probably going to skip this architecture. I put it there so that as a record, if people are interested in look at how we set this up for Composer, and if you want to have similar setup on-prem, it sort of like gives you a kind of like a reference design on how things can be configured. Like I said, the other thing is, when you manage Composer or when you try to offer Composer as a managed Airflow service, you want things to work out of the box for you. So that's why we also put a lot of emphasis doing a lot of like a cross-service integration with other GCP products. Those are the GCP products that we already support today. And then in fact, we are teaming up with a contractor who's going to add a lot of more GCP services or GCP operators in Airflow. Anyone in the community who is interested in working together with us on adding more GCP operators or reviewing those GCP operators, please just drop me a note, and then happy to connect you with them. Now comes really the interesting part. Is on like challenges for running Airflow as a managed service. Like I said, a lot of those are feedback we have heard from our customers. We just pick the ones that apply to Airflow as well. There are some feedback on Composer specific, so which are not covered here. One thing we heard the most is really about like DAG deployment and development. People mention that there's no good tool for them to do Airflow development. Pretty much we always assume like magically they know how to create Airflow DAGs and then deploy Airflow DAGs. We thought about some of the low-hanging fruit, like maybe have Eclipse plugins or IDE plugins. At least you could have auto-completion, DAG syntax highlighting. Those seems pretty trivial and easy to attain. So that's one thing. People also complain about, what's the best way? And they constantly come to us and say, what's the best way for us to test Airflow DAGs? Well, our practice so far is like, hey, why don't you just create a dev composer environment and then you have a production composer environment. So you can sort of like focus your development in one composer environment or even like a one GCP project. And if you need to move to production, you just copy your DAGs out to the production environment. But still, that's not ideal. I mean, in case that think about it on-prem, how would you be able to effectively test your Airflow DAGs, considering the fact that often it requires availability of external systems? If you have connectors, you're running tasks, those need to talk to the external systems. So that's, I think, one thing that maybe the community can all work together, trying to find better ways of testing DAGs. The other things are really about DAG CI/CD. Likewise, we understand that people have different ways of setting up Airflow environments. For example, on Cloud Composer, we use GCS, Google Cloud Storage Bucket, to back up all the DAGs and distribute the DAGs among our Airflow instances. And I also know that a lot of people use, say, GitHub to try to sync DAGs. So there are various ways of syncing DAGs or distributing DAGs. So it really boils down to, can we come out with better DAG management abstractions in Airflow? So there's a common interface for everyone to talk to the Airflow system. Once we have this common layer, it makes it possible for us to come out with best CI/CD practice. Second thing is more about some of the issues we have seen on task scheduling, execution, and debugging. One thing we can, it's probably good for us because that means we can earn more money. Our customer come to us saying, hey, look, I run a GCP task, but my task needs to wait for like an hour. For example, like sometimes people run BigQuery job. It can be the case that BigQuery job takes an hour or two to finish. So at the same time, you just have Airflow task like running idle there, waking up every, a few seconds, try to query the BigQuery job status. So to them, it's like a huge waste of their resource. So they are all trying to say, hey, what's the best way for us to make Airflow more resource efficient? Here, we're trying to suggest, like I said, totally open for discussion. And maybe we should introduce something like asynchronous execution mode in operators, which you can record as sync execute, but you have ways to record states you have executed in the past. So that might be one way. The other thing we have noticed, like really about memory consumption. This is with respect to serial executor. Maybe other executor may be different, but for each Airflow task, like two processes are spawned. One is running the actual Airflow task. The other one is for babysitting the task. We found that pretty much all Airflow modules are loaded, which creates a lot of memory pressure in the system. So again, there are ways that we can try to optimize. And then right now, with the solution we give to people, like maybe you have beefy machines, fewer workers. Those are not ideal. If we want to really solve the problem from the root, we probably have to try to see ways how we can optimize or minimize the number of Airflow processes you have to load and start. The last thing is really about like debugging support. As I mentioned, sometimes you have incomplete task failure information, which can be very confusing for the users. One thing we notice in general for Airflow is like there might be some logging latency. You could have the logs. You started your library. You maybe call into another library which spew out a lot of logs. It takes a while for those logs to actually get accumulated and appear in Airflow Web UI. Sometimes people want to see those logs a lot sooner. In Composer, it's possible because they have stack drive logging. In open source, that's probably a signal that it might also be good for Airflow to have something like a Fluentd or CollectD integration, so you have logs or metrics reported elsewhere. Next thing is probably going to say is really about release, bug fix, and transparency. I know our Airflow committers has spent a tremendous amount of efforts on making a release out. So this is definitely not a complaint for the committers. I feel like it's really about the process can be improved. And then this is probably where a place like Google wants to help. So we can say, we can put resource on helping the community to make it faster and quicker releases. As a result of like us not being able to, get to the latest version of Airflow, so we have to do a lot of like a backporting for bug fixes. Sometimes our customers say, hey, this is a critical bug, we need to backport. Likewise for features. So it's a pain for us to manage a lot of patches internally. Plus, the customer wants to know like what exactly are you running? Because I want to reproduce your setup on Prime. That's why we also plan to host a Composer Airflow repo that contains all the code that runs inside it, Composer. A big disclaimer here: Google has no intention to fork Airflow. We'll continue to checking our code to Airflow master. This is merely for us to share the code we have with our customers. Again, no intention to fork Airflow here. The last thing is really about isolation protection and auto awesomeness. This is probably more, it's a highly demanded enterprise customer features. I think like, in the previous 2 meetups, we have discussion about Airflow Web Server RBAC. I think that's a great step towards access isolation. We have isolation at least on a web UI. Now, the question is, how can we make sure that that isolation carries through in the entire system? We have some ideas. We have, in fact, started some early work on this space. Once we have something more concrete, we're happy to share our proposal and work together with the community. The problem here, really, we're trying to address is, if you're going to say someone or some access some information is only available to a particular tag, you not only want to make sure that's the case for the web server, but how can you prevent that's the case for the entire workflow execution? Likewise for protection, even though, think about it today, probably is the case that any Airflow tag during execution can easily run a command, say drop database. At that point, that's, you lose all your data. So really, how could you provide that kind of isolation among all your Airflow tags, even though there might exist like ill-behaved workflows? They could try all their best to try to get sensitive connection data. They try their best to hog all CPU resources. How could you design your system in a way that isolation is provided from ground up? Last point, I feel like it's probably not very applicable for now for Airflow, is a lot of our customer wants, auto awesomeness. Means they want auto scaling, they want things to be auto upgradable. Means also that auto upgrade includes, if I have a new Airflow version released, I want to automatically migrate my setup to that new release version. Auto here as well. Sometimes my task running into failure maybe is also good. Like, Airflow or Composer itself can mitigate some of the failures, if those failures are related to infrastructure. So with that, I'll probably quickly wrap up on some of our priorities that we plan to work next. Like I mentioned, Airflow release process, that's the one thing. And then we really want to help to say, how can we get Apache Airflow graduated sooner from the incubator status? I know there's also ongoing work on refactoring Airflow operators, as well as like hook packages for both release and also just, for better streamline management. So that's also one thing we want to help. Happy to share some of our GCP operator development style guide. In fact, we are working with some internally, and we're also going to share that pretty soon with the community on some of the development guideline we have on GCP operators. If people have similar services, that might also be a good place to look for. Like I said, reduce Airflow resource usage by embracing asynchrony in the system. Expand API coverage to have workflow and a task as first-class citizens in API. Last things we want to work on, end-to-end security, tag level isolation, connection, access management, all that stuff. Specifically for people who care about a Cloud Composer, like I said, one thing we're working on is like really make Composer tag-centric. So we want workflow or tag level access, isolation, and protection. Certainly, as I mentioned earlier, adding more GCP operators, and then making sure that those GCP operators work well with Composer. Last thing is resource elasticity. We want really to be able to spawn and essentially, like, consume resource at need. When you don't need a resource, you don't consume anything. Yeah, that's everything I have. Thank you for your time. And then if you want to at least some of the Airflow Apache links, and then also list some of the links for Composer. We also have like a public talk, if in case you are, you want to find out more about Cloud Composer. Thanks. I can